The mansion stood hidden deep in the dense woods, so far removed from civilization that my phone lost signal long before I arrived. The road leading to it narrowed into a twisted path of gravel and moss, flanked by towering trees that blocked out the sun like a tunnel. When I first saw it, it didn't look real, like a painting, too grand and too perfect to exist in the middle of nowhere. They had told me the job came with full privacy and no interruptions, which I had thought would be perfect for the quiet life I was seeking. But standing in front of that colossal stone structure, I felt something I couldn't explain, like I was being pulled in and warned away at the same time. I was offered the position through a private hiring agency I hadn't even applied to. The offer came in an unmarked envelope with a short message typed out: "Live-in caretaker needed. No prior experience required. Excellent pay. Immediate start." Attached was a check with an advance payment more than I had made in the last 3 months combined. I don't know why I accepted. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something the letter didn't say, something that found me instead of the other way around. When I arrived, a tall, silent man greeted me at the massive front door. He didn't speak much, only showed me to my room and gave me a list of duties. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded like it had been photocopied over and over. Most of the chores were basic: cleaning, checking the pantry, making sure the fireplaces were lit in certain rooms at night. The last line read, "Do not enter the West Wing, ever." I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But the way the man stared at me made my skin crawl. He didn't blink once. The mansion was enormous, 4 floors, 27 rooms, hidden corridors, and staircases that curved in unnatural ways. My footsteps echoed strangely in the halls. It always felt like someone had just turned the corner ahead of me, like I was always seconds behind whoever or whatever was moving around. Sometimes I'd enter a room and find the window open when I was certain I'd closed it. The curtains would be swaying, though the wind outside was still. The first night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe. That's the only way I can describe it. The wood would creak and shift like lungs expanding and contracting. I got up to check the source, thinking maybe there was a heating vent or an old furnace somewhere. But the sounds didn't come from the walls or the floors. They came from everywhere, like the house was listening to me. By the 3rd day, I started asking questions. Who owned the mansion? Why was the job so well paid for such light work? And why had the last caretaker supposedly left suddenly without notice? The silent man wouldn't answer. He just stared, his eyes dull and almost foggy, as if he wasn't truly there. The one time I raised my voice, I thought I saw a flash of something in his eyes, a shimmer of fear, maybe, or recognition. He mumbled something under his breath before disappearing down the hallway, and I didn't see him again for the rest of the day. I began to sense a presence that never made itself fully known but could always be felt. Shadows would stretch longer than they should. I'd feel cold air brush my shoulder when no windows were open. I'd catch movement in the corners of mirrors, only to turn and find nothing there. But the strangest thing of all was how the mansion seemed to rearrange itself. Doors I had already opened before would now lead to different hallways. Rooms I had cleaned the previous day were suddenly dusty again. It was like the mansion didn't want to be known. It didn't want to be understood. On the 5th night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not from outside, but from inside the walls. At first it was faint, like mice. But then it grew louder, like nails dragging across wood, rhythmic and deliberate. I pressed my ear against the wall and thought I heard whispering. Not words, just sounds. Hushed, urgent sounds, like someone was trying to speak through layers of stone. I didn't sleep again that night. The mansion's beauty was unmatched, but it held secrets that didn't want to stay hidden. Grand chandeliers hung above ceilings painted with ancient scenes I couldn't recognize. Some of the artwork looked disturbingly realistic, like the people in them had once lived and were now watching from their frames. One portrait in the dining hall kept catching my eye. It was of a man who looked eerily like me. The signature at the bottom had faded, but the date read 1896. By the end of the first week, I knew I had made a mistake. The mansion was not just a house, it was a presence. It didn't just stand in the woods, sit fed off them. It was never meant to be empty, never meant to be silent. It wanted something, and I was starting to believe the job offer wasn't about work at all. It was about luring someone in, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone like me. I had only been in the mansion for a few days when I noticed something strange about the rooms. They didn't stay the same. At first, I assumed it was just my unfamiliarity with the layout. The place was massive, and it wasn't hard to get lost among winding staircases and endless corridors. But I began to realize that it wasn't just me. The rooms themselves were moving. I would pass a hallway with 3 doors, then return 5 minutes later to find only 2. A library I had cleaned that morning would suddenly be filled with dust and cobwebs by afternoon, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. One particular incident left me shaken. I was carrying a tray of firewood to the main parlor, a large room with stained glass windows and velvet chairs. I had lit the fireplace there the night before, but when I opened the door, it wasn't the parlor. It was a stone staircase descending into a dark, windowless basement. The air that rose from it was cold and wet, and it smelled of something foul and decaying. I stood there for a moment, confused and frightened, then closed the door and stepped back. When I opened it again, moments later, the parlor had returned, fireplace still warm, logs still crackling. I left the tray on the floor and didn't look back. What unsettled me more than the rooms shifting was how the changes never seemed to happen when I was watching. They waited until I looked away. If I blinked or turned around, things would be different when I looked again. The paintings on the wall would change slightly. The eyes of the figures would be looking in a new direction, or their faces would stretch into faint, unfamiliar expressions. The lighting in a hallway would dim as I passed, then brighten again. Behind me, I started to feel like the mansion was testing me, observing how I reacted to its subtle manipulations. I decided to test my theory. One morning, I placed a small statue from the study onto a table in the hallway. I took a photo with my phone and left it there while I went to dust the dining room. 20 minutes later, I returned. The table was gone. Not just the statue, the entire table had vanished. It wasn't moved or knocked over. There wasn't a mark on the carpet where it had stood. I checked my phone again, and the photo I had taken no longer existed. My gallery skipped from image 127 to 129. The mansion hadn't just moved, the table lit had erased the evidence of it entirely. I began marking doors with chalk, a small X at the bottom of each one I passed. By evening, most of them were gone. Only one remained, and it had been smeared, like a hand had tried to wipe it away. I never saw anyone else in the house besides the silent man, and he was never around when these things happened. I asked him once about the changes, about whether he had ever gotten lost. He just shook his head, slowly, as if even acknowledging. The question could draw unwanted attention. The worst part was not knowing what was real. One afternoon, I found a room I had never seen before. A child's bedroom, perfectly preserved. Toys were scattered across the floor. The bed was made with pale pink sheets, and the walls were lined with shelves of picture books. A stuffed bear sat in the window seat, worn but clean. I stood in that room for a long time, unsure what to do. It felt frozen in time, untouched by the decay I'd seen elsewhere. When I returned the next day, the door to that room led to a broom closet. No windows, no toys, no trace that the other space had ever existed. I never found that child's room again. The mansion didn't follow normal rules. It existed in a kind of controlled chaos, rooms folding in on themselves, doorways becoming traps, hallways leading back to places you had already left. I began to lose track of time. Sometimes I'd wake in the morning and it would be night outside. Other times, the sun would remain frozen in the same position all day, casting the same sharp shadows across the floor for hours. My clocks stopped working after the first week. The silence between the ticking became too long, and the hands would twitch and spin without meaning. Once, I followed the sound of music down a hallway I thought I knew. It was a piano playing soft and delicate. I turned each corner slowly, trying not to startle whoever was playing. The sound grew louder, richer, and I found myself at a door I didn't recognize. When I opened it, the music stopped instantly. The room was empty, dust thick on the keys of a grand piano. On the bench sat an old, worn metronome, ticking steadily without moving. I no longer trusted my senses. The mansion twisted them until I couldn't be sure what was real and what was imagined. The place had a mind of its own, and it seemed determined to confuse and trap anyone who tried to understand it. Every door became a gamble. Every hallway could loop into itself. There were no maps, no patterns, only the constant creeping knowledge that the house was shifting itself to isolate me. Or worse, it was guiding me, leading me toward something I had not yet seen, something it wanted me to find. I had just begun to settle into a routine at the mansion when I noticed the paintings. At first glance, they seemed like typical portraits, elegant, oil-brushed images of the mansion's previous owners, dressed in outdated clothing, their expressions solemn and aristocratic, the kind of artwork you'd expect in a place like this. But after a few days, I started to sense something wrong. Subtle at first, a shift in posture, a glint in the eye, a slight curl at the corner of a mouth that hadn't been there before. These changes didn't happen while I watched, but rather between glances, like a difference you can't quite prove, but your instincts scream is there. One morning, I was dusting the grand hallway and passed a tall portrait of a man holding a cane with a little girl standing beside him. I remembered the girl's face, vividly sweet, soft, almost angelic. But when I passed the same painting that evening, the girl's expression had changed. Her mouth had drawn tight, her eyes narrowed, and her head tilted in a way that made her look older, almost menacing. I thought I was imagining it, but the feeling stayed with me, crawling under my skin, pushing me to examine the other paintings more closely. It quickly became an obsession. I started cataloging every painting in the house, sketching them roughly into a notebook, noting their positions, sizes, and facial expressions. But my sketches never matched what I saw the next day. One portrait, a woman in a red gown with a pearl necklace, began to haunt me. She always faced slightly to the left, her hands folded neatly, but over time, her body seemed to turn more and more toward me. Her gaze, originally demure and distant, locked into mine with such intensity that I felt it burning into me, like she was angry that I had noticed her. I tried moving the paintings, taking them off the walls, turning them around. It didn't help. I'd return to the hallway the next morning and find them back in their original spots, hung perfectly, no sign of dust or disturbed frames. Once, I left one leaned face down against the wall, its eyes safely hidden. That night, I heard scratching behind my door, a soft but persistent scraping. When I opened it, the portrait was upright again, directly across the hallway from me, closer than before. I didn't remember putting it there. In fact, I was sure I hadn't. The feeling that the paintings were watching me grew stronger each day. I could sense it even when I wasn't looking directly at them. That heavy, pressing awareness at the back of your skull, like something waiting for you to turn around. I began avoiding certain corridors just to escape their gaze. But the paintings kept appearing in new places, ones I swore had been bare before. Even the rooms I thought I had memorized started displaying unfamiliar artwork. One day, the study had a large landscape of a misty forest. The next day, it was gone, replaced by another portrait of someone I didn't recognize, but who somehow looked too familiar. Worse still were the sounds. Late at night, I'd hear faint whispers when walking past certain paintings. Not from inside the walls, but from the canvas itself, like the brush strokes had mouths, like the eyes could speak, if only I stood close enough to listen. One night, I pressed my ear against the frame of the woman in the red gown. The moment I made contact, the whispering stopped, and I swear I heard her voice in my head, cold, clear, saying just one word: closer. I had nightmares after that. Dreams where I was trapped inside the canvas, unable to scream or move, surrounded by hundreds of painted eyes. In the dreams, I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with oil and dust, and the walls bled paint. Faces stretched and melted around me, and the woman in the red gown stood in the distance, slowly walking toward me with her head tilted and her hands behind her back. Every night, she got closer. Then, I found the painting that didn't belong. It was in the attic, hidden under a cloth, much older than the others, its frame splintered and cracked. The figure in the painting wasn't clear, just a shape. A man, maybe, or something trying to look like one. No face, no color, just shadow. I didn't want to touch it, but I felt drawn to it. And that night, all the other paintings had changed. Every figure, every face, every background now showed that same shadowy presence somewhere in the distance. Hiding, waiting, watching. It dawned on me then that the paintings weren't just strange, they were alive in some way. They didn't capture people as they were. They trapped them, froze them in time, preserved their spirits within the canvas. And something, maybe that faceless shape, was feeding off them. Feeding off me too. The longer I stayed, the more I watched. It wanted attention. It wanted fear. The final straw came when I walked into the dining room and saw a new painting above the fireplace. I hadn't seen it before. It was me, standing in the hallway, holding my cleaning supplies. The exact clothes I wore that day, the same tired look in my eyes. And behind me, just barely visible in the dark background of the painting, stood the woman in the red gown, her hand resting on my shoulder. I turned around in panic, but the hallway behind me was empty. When I looked back, the painting was gone. Just a blank space on the wall. But I knew then whatever haunted these walls had taken an interest in me, and that meant it wasn't finished. I had hoped the strange occurrences would end if I ignored them. If I kept my head down and just did my job. But the longer I stayed in that mansion, the more the nights turned unbearable. Sleep no longer came easily. The silence in the building wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like something was always listening. I could hear faint breathing in rooms I knew were empty. I'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, not because of nightmares, but because of that feeling, the sense that someone was standing just inches from me, watching as I slept. It started with whispers in the halls just beyond, the edge of hearing, too quiet to understand, but close enough to sense. I'd stand frozen in the dimly lit corridors, straining my ears to catch the words, but the moment I focused, they would stop like they were aware of my attention. At first, I blamed the wind. The old house groaned and creaked with every breeze, after all. But this wasn't the sound of wood or wind. This was intentional, deliberate, intelligent. I began to avoid walking the halls at night altogether, but that didn't help, because soon enough, the strange sounds started inside my own room. The knocking was soft, at first barely audible, just 1 or 2 taps against the doorframe. Then it came again, then again, every night, precisely at 3:13 am, when I gathered the courage to check. No one was ever there. I tried staying awake to see it happen, but every time, no matter how hard I fought to keep my eyes open, I'd black out just before the sound started and wake up in a cold sweat moments later. My room colder than it should have been, like something had just left. One night, I woke to find my furniture moved around, not just shifted, slightly, completely rearranged. My bed was pushed to the other side of the room, my chair turned to face the door, and my suitcase had been unzipped and emptied. Everything laid out as though someone had been studying my belongings. The strange part, I hadn't heard a sound, not a single creak of wood or squeak of floorboards. It was like time had skipped while I'd slept, and someone or something had taken over in my absence. The temperature in the mansion started fluctuating unpredictably. Some rooms were unbearably cold, while others felt stifling hot, even when the weather outside was normal. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and could see my breath in the air, as if winter had settled in that one room alone. The fridge was warm, the windows frosted over, and in the fogged glass, I saw a handprint slowly form, even though I was the only one there. I tried confronting the groundskeeper, an old man named Eli who rarely spoke. I asked him if he'd experienced anything strange, if he knew about the whispers or the cold spots. He looked at me silently for a few moments before, finally muttering, "The house wakes up when it's watched too long." I asked what that meant, but he refused to say more. From that day on, he avoided me entirely. He wouldn't meet my eyes or stay in the same room for long. Things escalated quickly after that. I began seeing shadows move where there was no light source. Reflections in the windows didn't match reality. I would pass a mirror and see someone standing behind me, only to turn around and find the room empty. Once, I looked into a tall mirror in the hall and saw not my own reflection, but that of a woman in a black veil. She didn't move. She just stared, her hands folded at her waist. I backed away slowly, but she remained, even when I was nearly out of view. It was as if she was part of the mirror now, and I had unlocked something by seeing her. I tried to leave. I packed my bags, wrote a quick resignation letter, and reached the front door before dawn. But when I opened it, The outside world was gone. I don't mean it was dark, I mean it wasn't there. Just a thick, endless fog, rolling and churning like smoke from a fire, but without the heat or the smell. I couldn't see the trees, the driveway, or even the sky. I took one step out and instantly felt something wrong, like the ground underfoot wasn't solid, like the air pressed too hard against my chest. I turned back immediately, but that single step left my shoes soaked in what looked like ink. It left a black trail as I walked back in, and the floorboards absorbed it slowly, like it was alive. After that, I stopped trying to leave. The mansion had no exits anymore. Every window showed something different. Sometimes a forest I didn't recognize, sometimes endless blackness, and once, just a reflection of the hallway I was standing in, repeated endlessly like a mirror trap. I wasn't in the world anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere shaped like a mansion but ruled by rules I didn't understand. The last time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the woman anymore. I saw myself older, tired, worn out. My eyes were sunken, my hands pale and shaking, and I was wearing a suit I didn't own. Behind me stood a familiar shape, the shadow figure from the old attic painting, now more defined, more solid. Its hand was on my shoulder, and I could feel its weight. When I spun around, it was gone, but the pressure remained. Now the mansion doesn't feel like a house at all. It feels like a trap, like something ancient and patient, watching from every corner, every portrait, every whisper in the night. And the worst part, I think it's waiting for me to accept it, to stop resisting, because the longer I stay, the more I begin to forget what it felt like to be outside, what the sun looked like, what normal felt like. And when I look into my reflection now, I'm starting to see it smile. My neighbor's house had always been a little odd, but I never thought much of it until the night I saw him digging in his yard under the moonlight. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe he was just planting something or dealing with a busted pipe. But there was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he was trying to be quiet. The next morning, there was no sign of the digging. The ground looked untouched. No loose soil, no tools, not even a patch of disturbed grass. I told myself I must have imagined it. But after that night, I started noticing other things. Lights would flicker in his house at strange hours. I'd catch glimpses of shadows passing by his windows when he clearly wasn't home. Once, I saw a face peering out of his attic window, too pale, too still. I tried to wave, thinking it might be a guest, but it just vanished the moment I blinked. I asked him about it the next day, casually mentioning the attic. His smile froze for half a second before he muttered that it was just storage space, and then quickly changed the subject. Then came the smell, faint at first, like damp earth and something metallic, but it grew stronger each day. A sickly sweet stench, like rotting meat mixed with chemicals. It clung to the air around his house, especially near the basement windows. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Either delivery guys would rush up his driveway, drop packages, and leave without knocking. Even stray dogs stopped going near the place. One night, I was walking back from the store and past his house when I heard a sound, something muffled, like a moan or a cry. I stopped and listened. There it was again. It was coming from his backyard. I crept closer, heart racing. As I neared the fence, I heard it more clearly. Someone was crying, not loud, not hysterical, just defeated, like they'd given up. I wanted to call the police right then, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a deep, instinctive warning that whatever was happening there wasn't meant to be interrupted. The next day, he greeted me like always, calm, polite, with that ever-present smile that never touched his eyes. I almost asked him about the sound, about the face in the attic, about the smell, but I didn't. I just smiled back, nodded, and went inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sounds in my head. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back to look, just once, and prove to myself I was overthinking it. I waited until after midnight. His lights were off. The street was silent. I slipped out with a flashlight and a weak sense of bravery. I climbed over the fence into his backyard. The smell was overwhelming now, no longer faint. It hit me like a wall. I gagged but kept moving. The yard looked normal enough, but then I saw it. The spot he'd been digging that night. Under the moonlight, I saw the ground was uneven, like it had been disturbed recently and then covered. Sloppily, I knelt down and brushed some of the dirt away. That's when I saw the fabric dark, stained, caught on a root. I froze. My hands trembled. I leaned in closer and saw something that made my blood go cold. A single, pale fingertip poking. Through the soil, I stumbled back, dropped the flashlight, and scrambled toward the fence. But I wasn't quiet enough. A light flicked on in his kitchen. Then another, upstairs. I didn't look back. I leaped over the fence and ran home, locking every door and window behind me. I called the police, breathless and shaking. They arrived, quickly, and went straight to his property. I watched from my window as they knocked on his door. He answered, calm as ever. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he smiled and nodded a lot. Eventually, they went into the backyard. Flashlights swept the yard. I saw them stop at the spot. I saw their postures stiffen. Then one of them called something out, and the others rushed over. It wasn't long before more cars showed up. More officers, crime scene tape, reporters. I saw them carry something out on a stretcher later that night, covered in a white sheet. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. People gathered in small groups, whispering about what had happened. The news said a body had been found and that my neighbor had been arrested without incident. But no name was released, no details. Just vague language about ongoing investigations and unidentified remains. I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare had ended. But a few days later, I got a letter. No stamp, no return address, just my name, written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photo, an old black and white picture of my neighbor. Younger, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. Both were smiling, but behind them was something else barely visible. A figure in the shadows. No eyes, no face. Just a wide grin that looked carved into its head and scrawled on the back. In red ink were the words, "It never stays buried."